This Disability Awareness and Communication e-learning course was created by New York City Emergency Management and the Mayor's Office for People with Disabilities as an awareness level training for city personnel and city contractors. We've designed this course to help you understand the obligation you have to assist people with disabilities, some different types of disabilities you may encounter, and to offer guidelines for respectfully interacting, reasonably accommodating, and effectively communicating with people who have disabilities. Barriers must be removed to ensure full participation by everyone, including people with disabilities. The more familiar we are with disabilities in our daily practices, the more likely we are to integrate and apply these good practices during emergencies. It's our obligation to provide reasonable accommodations to people with disabilities, not only because it's the right thing to do, but because it's the law.
In 1990, the United States government passed a civil rights law called the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA, to prohibit discrimination against people with disabilities. The law itself is divided into different parts called titles, and each title refers to different aspects of the community in which the law applies. Title I protects employees and applicants with disabilities from discrimination based on disability, including the right to be granted a reasonable accommodation on the job. Title II covers state and local entities with regard to providing people with disabilities equal access to programs, services, activities, and physical and programmatic access. Title II also applies to private entities contracted to do work with the government. Title III covers privately owned public accommodations, such as hospitals, doctor's offices, movie theaters, gas stations, and restaurants. Title IV establishes the telecommunication relay services, which is how people with hearing or speech difficulties can communicate by telephone when their disability prevents the use of the conventional telephone.
The final title contains a variety of provisions relating to the ADA as a whole, including its relationship to other laws, state immunity, its impact on insurance providers and benefits, prohibition against retaliation and coercion, illegal use of drugs, and attorney's fees. This title also provides a list of certain conditions that are not to be considered as disabilities. As with any law, the terminology used within it is important to understand in order to ensure proper interpretation and application. According to the ADA, we define disability as a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities, or having a record of such impairment, or being regarded as having such impairment. In order to understand this definition, we need to understand some of the terminology that it uses. So, what do we mean by a physical impairment? It's a disorder of the sense organs, motor functions, and body systems. Examples might include hearing, walking, or talking. What is meant by mental impairment? It includes most psychological disorders as well as learning disabilities and emotional or mental illness. What do we mean by major life activities? These can include caring for oneself, performing manual tasks, seeing, hearing, eating, walking, breathing, and communicating, just to name a few. These major life activities are substantially limited when the person is unable to perform the activity or is significantly restricted in doing so. In New York City, it is important to note that we maintain an even broader, more inclusive definition of disability than federal law. Under the New York City Human Rights Law, we define disability as any physical, medical, mental, or psychological impairment, or a history or record of such impairment. The disability does not have to substantially limit major life activities, nor does it require a clinical or laboratory diagnosis.
Understanding the concepts and terminology of the ADA is all well and good, but the human aspect is what makes this law so important. Living with a disability can be challenging. Living with a disability during a stressful period of time, like an emergency, can be especially difficult. At the end of the day, what matters is that you're well prepared and knowledgeable so you can best support and serve people with disabilities in New York City. People with disabilities know their disabilities better than anyone else, so it is beneficial to consult with them about solutions to barriers and other problems they are encountering. There are a number of different types of disabilities you may come across. Some may be visible, such as Down syndrome or blindness, and others may be hidden, things you do not readily see, such as an arthritic condition or multiple sclerosis. No matter the type of disability, the key principles for accommodating people with disabilities remain the same.
People with disabilities must be able to access the same programs and services as the general population. They must be able to access emergency programs and services that we provide. And people with disabilities must be given equivalent access to the same information provided to the general population, as well as have the right to participate in and receive the benefits of emergency programs, services, and activities. People with disabilities have a right to reasonable accommodation in the provision of all government programs and services. And they have the right to information about all of the rights we just discussed. Therefore, we must find ways to reasonably accommodate people with disabilities. This simply means that we must ensure a person with a disability can enter and use our facilities and/or enjoy the benefits and privileges of our programs and services. City employees must be mindful that when someone with a disability asks for something in a different format or wants us to do something a little differently, to seriously consider the request. Examples of accommodations that may be provided include, but are not limited to, help filling out an application, arranging for accessible transportation for those that have difficulty traveling, giving a person more time to submit documents or complete tasks, providing additional explanations of forms and rules, reading notices and program materials to an individual, providing notices in alternate formats such as enlarged print or audio versions, modifying activities and modifying policies, practices, and procedures for people with disabilities, when necessary, to avoid discrimination, including, but not limited to, intake procedures, documentation requirements, allowing preferential access to electrical outlets, and refrigeration for medication.
Our city services, programs, and activities must be held in an inclusive setting. During times of emergencies, our programs and resources must be accessible for everyone. This might mean a program's current setup or requirements need to be modified so that everyone has equal access to it.
Consider this common scenario.
A city council office is preparing for a community hearing. You visit the meeting site beforehand and realize that the location is a media room on the second floor of a building with no elevator. Anyone whose disability prevents them from using the stairs will not be able to attend the hearing and thus would be effectively prohibited from taking part in a civic activity, a potential ADA violation. It also denies the general public the benefit of input from those individuals. A co-worker suggests putting chairs on the lawn in front of the facility and setting up a screen and a microphone system. This way those unable to ascend the stairs could watch a broadcast of the proceedings and pose their own questions and comments during the public comment period. But that idea doesn't provide equal access in the most inclusive setting possible and would therefore be a violation of the ADA. The best solution would be to move the meeting to an accessible location where the whole community can attend and participate in the community hearing. For additional information on the city's provision of reasonable accommodation for people with disabilities, please contact the Mayor's Office for People with Disabilities or specific agency ADA coordinators or disability service facilitators.
Each person with a disability you work with will have different needs depending on what type of disability they have, and in just a few minutes we'll look at specific guidelines for assisting people with different types of disabilities and how that disability affects them. For now, though, let's look at some general guidelines that should be kept in mind regardless of the disability. The most important thing to remember is they are people, not a disability. To help you grasp this concept, let's think about 3 different famous people. When we talk about these famous people, we tend to talk about the person's accomplishments, and then Sometimes we mention the disability. This is the premise for what is referred to as people first language. We see them as people first. President Franklin D. Roosevelt was a politician who was responsible for the New Deal, the creation of the FDIC, and the Social Security Act, and he used a wheelchair for mobility. Harriet Tubman was a famous leader of the Underground Railroad who led over 1,000 people to freedom from slavery, and she experienced bouts of epilepsy. Stephen Hawking is an astrophysicist whose disability prevents him from moving or communicating without technology or assistance. Examples of people first language include the following:
The man who is blind, the woman who has a speech disability, or the child who is deaf. We need to avoid language that dramatizes a person or invokes pity. Franklin D. Roosevelt was not stricken by polio and confined to a wheelchair. Rather, he had polio and later used a wheelchair for mobility when he couldn't use his legs. Saying that someone is bound to his wheelchair summons a picture of a person literally tied to a wheelchair instead of simply using the wheelchair as a means to move about. Handicap is a term for golfers and certain other sports and is not an appropriate term for referring to people with disabilities. Neither is the term disabled person. Avoid turning a person's condition into a label for that person. For example, say a person with schizophrenia and not a schizophrenic, or a person with paraplegia, not a paraplegic. Please do not use the term mental retardation. This term has been replaced by intellectual disability.
Remembering people with disabilities are people and not a disability is the single most important concept. Once that's understood, everything else falls into place. For instance, don't assume someone needs help just because they have a disability. Would you do that for someone you think doesn't have a disability? Of course not. Instead, you would ask them if they need assistance, and you would wait for an answer before you assist them. Always speak directly to the person with a disability. Don't speak to their companion, aide, or interpreter. Treat adults as adults. Address people who have disabilities by their first names only when extending the same familiarity to others. Don't be afraid to ask questions when you're not sure what needs to be done. Just because someone has a disability doesn't mean you know what's best for them. Let them tell you what they need and let them make their own decisions. People with the same disability may have different accommodation needs. Also, be sensitive about personal contact. For example, avoid leaning on people's wheelchairs or grabbing people who are blind. Instead, offer your arm to guide them. In other words, treat people with disabilities as people. Treat them the same way you want to be treated, with kindness and respect. That said, there are some things to know when working with people who have a specific type of disability. If you're speaking with a person who has a speech disability, it's important to be patient and allow the person to finish speaking. Don't jump in and finish the sentence for them. When they're finished, if you aren't sure you understood, clarify what you heard. Are you asking for X, Y, and Z? If the answer is no, ask the person to repeat. If you're still having trouble, it's okay to tell the person you're having trouble understanding them and ask if there's another way to communicate. The person may prefer to write. If you have a coworker who's better at understanding speech differences than you are, you may ask that person to assist you. It's never okay to pretend to understand when you don't, because ultimately that would prevent the person from getting the same service they would get if they did not have a speech disability. Take your time and express your difficulty in understanding, and not the person's difficulty in speaking.
If you are talking with a person who is blind, introduce yourself. If you need to leave to retrieve someone or something, let the person know that you are leaving and that you will return shortly. Announce yourself when you return. Without proper communication, the person may continue to talk to you and wonder why you are not answering. If someone who is blind asks where the bathroom is, don't point. You can explain how to get there. For example, turn left to the end of the hall, turn right, and it is the first door on the right. Or you may offer your arm to guide them. Don't grab their arm to lead them somewhere. Let the person you are guiding be the one to hold on to you. If a person who is deaf requests a sign language interpreter, one will be provided if needed. Do not insist on a person writing back and forth with city staff in lieu of getting an interpreter. Writing is too onerous for complicated discussions to be had with ease. Furthermore, American Sign Language and English are two distinct languages, and not everyone who uses ASL is fluent in English. At the time of the appointment or meeting, the interpreter will likely discuss with the person who requested the interpreter where they would prefer the interpreter to sit or stand. Lighting and window glare should be checked to make sure the interpreter and client can see each other.
When communicating with individuals who are hard of hearing, speak slowly and make sure that you are facing the listener. Keep your hands away from your face, and if you're wearing sunglasses, remove them. Be patient and repeat yourself if necessary. If an area with less ambient noise is available, offer the individual opportunity to talk to you there, but don't insist on it. If someone uses a wheelchair, a scooter, or other mobility aid, don't lean or hang on their device. The device is a part of their personal body space, and this can be uncomfortable for that person. Be sure to keep ramps and accessible doors to your facility open and unblocked. Also, be sure to place items within a user's reach. When you speak with someone in a wheelchair, sit at their level if your conversation will take longer than a minute or two. If that's not possible, stand at a slight distance to level your eye contact. Make sure to provide directional signage. If not all entrances are accessible, provide signage at the inaccessible entrances, directing people to the accessible entryway. Directional signage should also be provided to function areas and to exits. You may come across people who have cognitive, intellectual, developmental, and/or mental health disabilities. Keep in mind, they need timely, accurate, and accessible information using plain language. This might mean you need to break content into smaller, simpler steps. Communication is crucial when working with a person with these types of disabilities. Be sure to ask specific questions to elicit specific and accurate responses. If necessary, repeat questions in different ways to verify their responses. Stay calm and patient. Especially during an emergency, it can be difficult to separate intellectual disabilities out from mental health or developmental disabilities. Regardless of the type of disability, be aware that stress can limit people's functionality. Cognitive, intellectual, or developmental disabilities are not always known to the person. As such, they might be unlikely to request reasonable accommodations even though they may need them. Ask the person whether they need assistance and be specific about what you can offer. As a city employee or a city contractor, you cannot require clients to accept an accommodation. Keep in mind, individuals have the right to refuse assistance. Signs that a person has a mental health disability might include confused thinking or problems concentrating, extreme mood changes that include uncontrollable highs or sadness, as well as prolonged or strong feelings of irritability or anger. When speaking to a person exhibiting these signs, be sure to listen to their concerns, speak calmly, and de-escalate their anxiety. If the person appears to be a danger to themselves or others, call 911 immediately. Some people live with a long-term disability as a result of a brain injury. Those who have brain injuries may appear disoriented, confused, frustrated, have difficulty finding words, and may require assistance completing forms or reporting events in a sequence. Slight muscle loss may also be an issue. Social skills may be affected as well. You may need to use several different forms of communication to meet an individual's needs.
Some disabilities are related to chronic illness or other health maintenance needs. According to the U.S. Census Bureau's 2011 American Community Survey, about 48% of Americans say they take a prescription medication. 1 in 3 Americans takes a prescription drug to treat a long-term illness or condition.
When working with individuals who take medication, be sure to provide access to their medication. This can include food and water to take with their medicine, refrigeration, supplies, and/or assistive devices to prevent or minimize medical emergencies in the midst of a disaster. While in the field, you may come across service animals. Under the ADA, these are generally dogs, sometimes miniature horses, which are individually trained to do work or perform tasks for people with disabilities. Under New York City law, Other animals may work as service animals. Some of the tasks service animals provide may include guiding a person who is blind, alerting people who are deaf or hard of hearing to sounds in the environment, alerting a person of an oncoming seizure so they can take medication or get somewhere safe before the seizure begins, alerting a person with diabetes if their blood sugar is too high or too low so that they can take medicine or eat something, alerting a person with a psychiatric disability of the need to refocus or take medication, alerting a person whether it is safe to proceed or to not eat something given certain allergens, retrieving items, opening doors, pulling a wheelchair, psychiatric service dogs that help people with PTSD know when they are about to have a panic attack and redirect their attention, and assisting a person with a mobility disability with balance. Under the ADA, state and local governments, businesses, and nonprofit organizations that serve the public must allow service animals to accompany people with disabilities in all areas of the facility where the public is allowed to go. If it's not clear that an animal is a service animal, you can ask 2 and only 2 questions. Is the animal a service animal required because of a disability? And what work or task has the animal been trained to perform?
Staff cannot and should not ask about the person's disability. Staff may not require medical documentation, nor require a special identification card or training documentation for the animal. Staff also may not ask that the animal demonstrate its ability to perform the work or task it has been trained to do. We can't stress enough, the only way to ascertain whether an animal is a service animal is based upon the answers to the 2 questions that you are allowed to ask, not on the appearance of the animal, lack of special certification, or your own suspect feelings or opinions.
Please note, not all service animals wear a harness when working. Before you touch or pet a service animal, be sure to ask the owner for permission, even if the animal initiates the contact. This was a general overview of different types of disabilities and how best to assist those who have them. In the midst of a stressful situation, we know you're not going to remember every detail that was mentioned. The important thing to keep in mind is those who have disabilities are not defined by their disability. When in doubt, ask people what they need. If you remain uncertain on how to assist, please contact the Mayor's Office for People with Disabilities or specific agency ADA coordinators or disability service facilitators.
Treating people with disabilities the way you want to be treated is the right thing to do. But more than that, it is our obligation because it's the law. We must provide reasonable accommodation to people with disabilities. Understanding how to do this should be part of our everyday practice, so it becomes integrated into how we interact and communicate with the people around us. In our daily lives and in emergency situations, we must respectfully treat, reasonably accommodate, and effectively communicate with people who have disabilities. Remember, people with disabilities can help with creative problem solving, as they are the experts in what and how they need to receive an accommodation. We must treat everyone respectfully and find ways to accommodate the people we serve at all times. For more information on this subject, please contact the Mayor's Office for People with Disabilities, MOPD, at www.nyc.gov/MOPD.